Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Live series. For the month of March, I'm going to focus on a practical leadership question. What actually expands a leader's ability to influence organizations grow in complexity? As you know, I talk a lot about rapid change, whether it's from technology or just geopolitical. There's trade things going on. There's so much happening right now that the pace of change is unprecedented. And it will revert back to some mean, but the question is what that, the reversion of the mean, what is that mean going to be? Regardless, we have to adjust as organizations to meet that moment. And that's what March is going to be about. It's not a one size fits all. And in looking at this, I had to decide, where do I approach it? Because if you look at organizations as they grow in scale, their needs are different. Those organizations, to go from 10 people to 20 is different than going from 20 to 50, and that's different than going from 50 to 100. Now, there's a view of the amount of dollars coming in, right? You can look at it from how the revenue, whether it's 1 million or 5 million or 20 million. But I think because of the amount of independent contractors, freelancers, virtual assistants, and just different ways of approaching marketing and sales problems, I think it's also useful to look at the number of people that you have. And that has to include some blend of employees and independent contractors. And when you look at it that way, I like to focus on how many levels of leadership are there in an organization. And for the context of this conversation, I'll use leadership and management interchangeably. But I would argue that management is going to be managing a frontline group, and then the leaders have managers or leaders underneath them. But the point here is how many levels. And the hardest one, I think, is to go from an individual owner with multiple direct reports. And you can see people will thrive at 5 and then struggle at 10 and 12 is just too much. There's a reason why 8 has been a span of control forever. Now, there are some unique situations like call centers where you can have 25 people or researchers, there's 25 people reporting to one person, and even more than that. And then there's other dynamics where you have like a personnel kind of leader over the person, but then they're on virtual teams and they function as part of a different team. So there's variations, but for the smaller company up to say 300 or 400 people, you can look at this as how many layers you have, and each one of those is a significant change. And there's a reason why there's a big bottleneck at that group, going from one person with multiple direct reports as an owner with multiple direct reports, and the next level of having a layer of management. Now, I talk about a leadership team, but in practice, this doesn't go from one person with 8 direct reports to one person with 4 leaders and direct reports. It's a slow process, but it doesn't have to be. Obviously, if you have some intention and a plan, and it costs money, of course, that too. But you're going from, whether it's an office manager or a general manager or assigning someone else to take care of this, a lead worker. There's different ways of approaching it, but doing so with the intention of not solving today's problem as the only thing you're focusing on, but rather building a leadership team. And that's where the focus of March is whether you're going from adding your first leader in between you and your direct reports or some of your direct reports, or if you're expanding that leadership team to having a 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 people reporting to the owner, or maybe it's the next level where you're putting managers under that leadership team. Each one of those adds a level of complexity and not something you want to take lightly. So one useful starting distinction is the difference between growing and scaling. Organizations can grow in headcount and revenue while still struggling operationally. Corrections can be made on the fly, activity can increase, may even trend upward. But scaling is different. Scaling means growing more efficiently. And I want to keep in mind that effective first and then efficient. So effective, but it means that they're growing more. It enables them to scale. It means capability, decision quality, and execution maturity increase along with size. This is why as companies mature, for some, revenue per employee is, and those tend to be the companies that continue to scale and grow, while others get stuck at a level that's difficult to surpass without adding layers of leadership, and it kind of flies in the face of scaling more efficiently. So there should be an expectation the revenue per employee will increase, and this is what makes it hard for small companies to compete with large companies, because large companies have a much more margin. They have a lot of people they can throw at innovation, prices, and because they're growing, and if the profit growing, I mean both percentage and dollar amount. It's one thing to have your percentage of growth of profit staying the same, but if you're losing the actual dollar amount because of hidden costs and the way you do accounting, that's a problem. You're not going to get to the efficiency that I'm talking about here. So growing efficiently does not happen naturally, but through intention, innovation, and disciplined execution. That transition requires a different kind of leadership influence, less direct control, and more ability to shape how people think, decide, and operate together. Teams, and I talk a lot about metaphors, whether it's a family metaphor, a political metaphor, or team metaphors, which is what I prefer. But then taking it to the next level and truly looking at it as a team, that you have to have a target, a common target, and there's a way to measure success, and everybody understands that. And then the effectiveness that none of us are as strong as all of us together. So freedom of action becomes necessary at each level in order to have an effective team. You don't have the coach in the player's ear 24/7 during a game, or constantly during a game. Now, maybe with the quarterback, but you understand the point that the players have to know their role. They have to have the skills, and they have to have their freedom of action to act on the fly in the absence of direction. Otherwise, people are just waiting to be told what to do. You have to bake that freedom of action. And as you add layers of leadership, even if you're just adding one layer, you are significantly increasing the amount of freedom of action that's in your organization. And this is why it takes intention for the owner to take this and sort of just a back of the hand kind of approach. They're going to be creating more problems than they solve. So I like to think about this beforehand and even consider iterating through. You may have to go through a few people before you decide how this is going to work. And when I say go through them, I don't mean in a bad way. I'm just talking about you may start with an office manager, and that may evolve to having a general manager who might be a different person. And that general manager might evolve to having two direct reports under the owner, and then managing the team. It just depends on the organization. But this is why you want to have a plan and have some intention. And then considering that no plan survives contact with reality, an ability to adjust. But having that North Star is so important to make sure that your decisions are lining up with what your intentions are, your ultimate intentions. Now, at the same time, leaders are continually asked to close gaps. Sometimes those gaps appear as innovation, new opportunities that generate energy and optimism. Other times they appear as crisis, conditions that create urgency or anxiety about potential loss. While the emotional tone differs, the leadership work is surprisingly similar to a degree. Both innovation and crisis require structured problem solving and effective leadership. Now, that's potentially a big difference in terms of what your folks do in an operational environment. When you're leading in an operational environment, you're benefiting from habits, you're benefiting from the I'll call it infrastructure that grows around that operations. And operations, excuse me, in an operational setting, you have inputs, you have outputs, there's expectations, there's a constant flow, and that process that's built around operations reinforces it. So when things go haywire and you have to get them back on track, one, there's a known way of how that should be. And because there's inputs coming in and outputs going out, it pressure tests it right away. And if a new problem exists, they correct that. This is why operational leaders tend to be very fast at correction. They just throw something. I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but it's like throwing something against the wall and see what sticks and then adjusting. That that approach does not work in project leadership. That approach does not work when you're closing a gap, because when you're closing a gap, you're often into a new territory and you don't know how your inputs are going to uh, result, what kind of outcomes they're going to result in. And as we change faster, we're going to, by definition, be in more project leadership work, whether it's innovating, which is proactive, or whether it's crisis, which is reactive. And it doesn't mean that if you're proactive, you're never going to have a reactive situation. Crisis can come from anywhere. It could come from, just like look at the geopolitical environment we're in right now, recording this in February of, or March of 2026. You have Ray Dalio in his book, Changing World Order. He talks about 5 different kinds of wars. There's geopolitical wars, there's trade wars, there's capital wars, there's technology wars, and there's military wars. And you could say there's all 5 of those going on right now. That's extraordinary in terms of planning and having a strategy for the future and being able to live into that. Requiring structured problem solving and effective project leadership is part of what we're talking about. Frameworks for those activities exist and are well documented, but they may not exist inside your organization. The way you have to approach the pressing needs is through operations. Project is something else. And anybody who's done the two as an owner, you've worn both hats. You've been in the project world work and you've been in the operational work. And you can tell how there's a big shift. And when you're doing one, the other side tends to fall apart. And when you're doing the other, this one side tends to fall apart. If you look at Myers-Briggs, the greatest breakdown in organizations is the N and the S. So the 4 dimensions in Myers-Briggs, MBTI, you can look that up. There's actually a free version you can take online. Just look up MBTI. Myers-Briggs type indicators, what that stands for. But you have E and I, extrovert, introvert. You have N and S, intuitive, sensor, thinker, feeler, and perceiver, judger. But the area where organizations break down the most, and I've gone through Myers-Briggs at least 7 times, because every time I picked up a new team, I took the leadership team through Myers-Briggs, and I went through with them. And the reason I do that is because I organize the work around their strengths, preferences, and skills. But the reason the N and the S break down is because while both need the entire picture, the N prefers the big first, the abstract, conceptual. They tend to describe things first. And when they're introducing something, they tend to go with the big picture, conceptual, abstract first. Whereas the S, the sensor, likes the detail and concrete first. Now they both take on the entire picture, as I said, but it's what they want first. And when they're describing something, they go with the detailed, concrete first. What's interesting is each one of those, and this is the facilitated Myers-Briggs. You won't get this out of taking the free one online or whatever, but the facilitated version to demonstrate this, and they have all the S's in a group and all the N's in a group. So they separate them out and study. And it's each time I've gone through this, it's been the same thing. N's are looking to change things and what can we do differently, and this has changed, and we're going to change that structure. And the S's tend to be more along the lines of, well, we have to tell them again, and we have to communicate better. Incentive or maybe, but it's always, the plan is always going to stay the same, and the people are the problem. Well, its system is wrong, and you need a blend both. So that's the other reason why I took people through, is because I wanted to have balance in designing innovations or designing a risk to a crisis. I want both the N and the S involved in that conversation. Now, assuming you have that, at least some project skill, and I'm not, a small company doesn't have of having project teams, but you can hire contractors, and you can have people in your organization trained in project management, plenty of training and classes that they can take to learn project management methodology. I'm not talking about the building roads and building buildings kind of project management. I'm talking about project management, which will grow with your organization, and those skills will grow along with it. The premium skill, though, is something else. The premium skill is whether innovation accelerates or crisis stabilizes, and that's the leader's ability to regulate and recover quickly enough that they do not introduce additional noise and rapidly reduce noise entering from the system. When you look at the founders of emotional intelligence, one of the important things is that the leader is able to regulate themselves quick, because it recognizes, emotional intelligence recognize how much the leader's tone can impact the organization. So influence at scale depends less on having better answers and more on maintaining coherence. The environment elevates, decisions compound, and pressure increases. This brings us to 3 guiding ideas to frame our discussions. First, expanding influence means helping others think and act with ownership rather than dependence. And this is what I'm talking about. This leads to that freedom of action as well, or guides the freedom of action. Second, leaders must learn to hold productive tension as capability grows around them. Like I mentioned, no plan survives contact with reality. There's tension all the time. And, I also like to think that we've moved from an environment or a world where you could get perfection in the closed room and then deliver a successful outcome that works. We don't know how it's going to show up. Things are going so fast. People are distracted. There's distractions coming in. People are stressed. It's just different settings for the people who are receiving whatever you deliver. So if you're marketing something, what existed when you first planned it in December could be completely different by the time March comes around. So it takes an iteration process. You have to iterate. I used to just say trial and error, which is like trial and error, but I say iterate through the development and iterate through the refinement. And that means you have to hold tension, because people get wedded to their ideas and they want to see that idea successful, and they start getting defensive. And the old school way was you put out your plan and you have to defend it to the end, and who's ever strongest at defending it kind of wins. You can't do that. You have to be reading the feedback. The same way no one can predict what piece of content is going to go viral. We don't know what ad copy is going to land just right. One type of ad copy may land perfectly with a particular audience, and for another audience it falls flat. You have to iterate and be willing to test, and that's why I talk about holding attention. The third is organizations benefit most when the 3 pillars of intrinsic motivation, autonomy, competence, and relatedness are strengthened through everyday leadership interactions. Intrinsic motivation is like an extra boost, another layer in your organization that drives work even when you're not watching, versus extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation, people get pleasure from the activity itself, and we get there by connecting the organization with the person's purpose. Last month, I talked about onboarding and the importance of understanding what their strengths and preferences are, and that enables you to have that conversation. And you don't need to have 100% overlap. You can have 2 or 3% overlap, as long as they can connect the dots between what's important to them and what they're doing. But it takes an active approach for the leader to connect those dots. To do this consistently, leaders must regulate early and with prevention in mind for themselves and also their teams. To begin before they're visible, when reactions accelerate and habits quieten. The leader has to be able to pick that up and adjust early. The early, far more impact and influence you can have. And this is where understanding habit dynamic practices like the 7-step reset, I'll talk about that regularly, they become relevant, not as personal development exercises, but as operational tools that help leaders maintain organizational coherence. Ultimately, this places additional responsibility on leaders. As organizations evolve to meet the accelerating pace of change, leaders must continuously consider not only what their organization is doing today, but what it needs to become. And that's what I was alluding to earlier. As we add in these layers of managers, I know that you have to watch the dollars before hiring, but people tend to wait until the last minute to hire that person. And then it takes time to get, by the time they're in, there's a backlog of work that needed to be done. You don't have time for development and training and structures and processes. An organization with layers that's just in reactive mode. So we want to make sure that we're doing that proactively. I know there's limitations, but when you to the organization, float is float, right? Right. So you kind of is getting started with it. Once you get started with it, then the process self reinforces itself. You have to be thinking about what development is required for people to operate successfully at that next, which means you need to have some sort of a narrative about what's coming. I use the changing world order and I overlay that with demographics are going to change, right? The changing world order, we don't know exactly what's going to come next, but we know that the US is declining and we may move from a singular superpower to maybe multiple players, or we may move from singular global currency to multi. We already are there to a degree. In terms of having more than one currency to three, who knows? But the point is, compared to what it was like in the US when we were rising, and all you had, it's very different when the US, and these economic cycles, economic cycle that the US is on is declining versus China. Wind is with them and wind is against us. So just having that understanding helps in terms of deciding how I'm going to innovate or what crisis how I'm going to approach a particular crisis. So development plans are not administrative, they are strategic instruments that prepare capability before it arrives. When leaders align individual growth, team development, and organization, scaling becomes intentional rather than reactive. That perspective will guide how we approach leadership development throughout this series. So there's always this backdrop that I want to bring in of development plans for yourself and development plans for your team. So I want to talk about those three areas and I'll just illustrate so we have a way of thinking about. So we have one. We talked about influence and borrowing from Stephen Covey, the center of influence versus the circle of influence versus the circle of concern. And in this circle of influence, we want this to expand. This shows up as initiative. It shows up as taking ownership. It shows up as moving the action forward. So as you expand your circle of influence, by definition, you're going to be increasing your circle of concern. I remember sharing this with a guy a couple of decades ago, and his thing was, that's not good because now I have more things to be concerned about. The point is, this is opportunity. As you expand, this is opportunity. And that's what you want to do. This is where scaling comes in. This is where the low-hanging fruit is used to help you. So this is what we want to do, but we need to have some direction around it. We can't just willy-nilly say, yeah, go out and expand your influence because you can get a lot of waste. So the next part we want to do is, and you can go down a deep rabbit hole in terms of mission, vision, and purpose. I think it makes a lot of sense to do this early on and get it figured out and do it with somebody so that you're getting some reaction. I like to go through the 7 questions Why is that important? And keep going to peeling back, so you know that what you have is the same thing that they're going to have 30 years from now. So it's a high enough level so it'll work, function decades from now, but you also needs to be granular enough that it gets you excited. And of course, I mean, the obvious thing is that your strategy needs to be aligned. So you don't want to have a misaligned strategy. And I'm just giving this the shorthand here because we don't want to get caught in this deciding purpose, vision, and mission. It's very complex, can be very complex. But then what you want to do from there is decide intentionally if this is direction of travel, this is our North Star. There's an area that's out of scope. So what I'm doing here, I'm putting some context around this idea of expanding influence. We don't just want to influence, we want to influence in a particular direction. The other thing that happens is we want to have a nice tight cone of focus. If this cone is 60 degrees from side to side, thinking about it like energy, you can maintain your momentum and still be pivoting through there. And with having a purpose, vision, and mission enables you to put some parameters around this. People initially don't like having boundaries and parameters and curbs, but curbs increase your increase your freedom of action because it helps people get focused, and there's only so many things that they're going to be able to do. And then we have this other area, and it's sort of a it's where you have to be aware, but you don't want to spend a lot of time there. So if we're saying we're not going to do this, this is the area what you discard. This might be what you delay because you want more information, but you don't want to just go chasing things. You don't want to just delay it and then add resources to it. You may want to gate it and say, okay, let's go 3 months. Let's see where things how things shape up, and then more time on that 90 days from let's do it. But you don't want to do a deep dive. And this is, I'm speaking generalistically here. You don't want to take what I'm saying and just go apply it. You have to make it make sense for yourself. But if this is your cone of focus, this becomes consideration. And this becomes awareness. You could also say this is discard, this is delay, this is delegate, and this is do. So you have do it, delegate it, delay it, discard it. And knowing what you're going to say no to and knowing what you're going to delay, potentially delay for 90 days. And it might, in your business, it might be 30 days, it might be 6 months, but it's more about a delay with some context around it. Let's see what shapes up. So you come up with some, we should be measuring. So you may want to look at, it's not going to be a KPI at this point, but you may look at an indicator. What is an indicator that we'll say happens that we want to look at in 3 months? So for example, in the US, we've been dealing with tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs expanding, and different things. And there's some decisions that companies have to make, and you can just like and be like the frog that gets boiled slowly, or you can be proactive about it, even though you don't know, and say, let's take a look in 90 days. And you put it on the calendar, you set a meeting, and then people can move on and stop worrying about it. We don't want to waste energy over here and over there. And then the last one is going to be, make sure I'm covering all the points. The last one is as I mentioned, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I don't care how long your organization exists. These three things have to do with human needs and psychology, and this is where intrinsic motivation comes from. So last month I talked about blue, red, and white language as a way to build habits. So we don't want to just direct our teams. We also want to build habits so that they're doing what they should be doing, they're doing what the organization needs, whether you're looking or not. We talked about blue language actually builds the habit because it taps into the same thing that habits get formed with: myelin synapses, dopamine, and serotonin. And then whereas red language tends to connect uh, pain and pleasure to the boss. And so when the boss is around, the action happens. When the boss is not around, they go back to status quo. With blue language, you're creating the tension inside of them so that their behavior shifts and the pleasure and pain is connected to actual behaviors. And then they do less of one and more of the other. And to do this, when we're creating, when we're innovating, when we're adjusting to crisis, we want to make sure we know the what, the why, the in versus out of scope, we need guiding principles, and we need outcomes/deliverables. So if you think in terms of this along with your problem solving methodology, because problem solving methodology is it always starts with clearly identify the problem. Einstein said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes talking about it and understanding it and only 5 minutes solving it. So if you have and obviously that doesn't scale, because if you have a really big problem, you're never going to use 90% of the time talking about it. But I think the concept still holds. So you have a problem solving model. And I think as an organization, you should choose one. There's 5-step models and there's 7-step models. Most usually the most common are 5 steps. You can look that up, pick one, and with artificial intelligence, have it present 2 or 3 with pros and cons and pick the one you're going to use. The incremental value of one over the other is not so great, but the value of having one versus not having one is transformational. So you want to have a problem solving methodology and one that your leadership team uses and your organization uses, so you have common language. And I would add on here requirements. Because requirements is how you're going to measure quality. And the outcomes are the deliverables. They'll have requirements. You'll have requirements potentially for how do we know those guiding principles are being followed in and out of scope or a form of requirements. And by having these things in place, frameworks, models, different things like that, we can now start moving into a direction where you can build your development plans. And so I want to have a high enough level that if you do things, it doesn't matter what's going on outside, you're going to be, and this is a way of thinking about how do I scale my leadership process. So in other words, you don't need a long drawn out to figure out how you're going to scale. You start, but start directionally correct. And I would say if you do nothing else but start with self-determination theory, that's what this is. Start with self-determination theory, and you can look that up, read about it. make your own opinions, but start with, how do I expand autonomy, competence, and relatedness in my organization? And what's the approach that's going to increase this? How do we set up our rewards? One of the things that is going to come into play as we talk about how do you decide who gets promoted, and that decision can be simplified by recognizing that the people who you're considering would not be in the conversation if they didn't get the results. Too often people get caught up on results. Well, I did this and I did that, and so did this, and they're the ones who should get promoted. You're not considering everybody for promotion. You're considering a small subset for promotion because they have certain skills, etc. They would not be in the conversation if they didn't have results. And I think another framework you can add on to that, just to start with and see if it plays out for you. But I would say that 70% of that promotion decision should be how they handle interpersonal situations, good and bad. And I don't want to say relationships because we don't want to slip into a political kind of lane. We want to make sure that they can regulate themselves. This is emotional intelligence, self-regulation, self-awareness and self-regulation, and then social awareness and relationship management. You want to see how they do those four, because as they move up in the organization, those become more and more important than moving widgets from here to there. So you want to make sure that those four pillars are in place. That's the 70%. 20% is what the organization needs at the time: fit, need, timing. And then the 10% would be results. So results play the smallest role, because once you get down to that 2 or 3 people, the results are a given. And the results that they got in the last position may require different skills than the results you're expecting in the next position. Too often we see leaders get promoted because they had the great results here. This is like, I don't mean anything bad by this, but it's an example where the top sales producer gets promoted to sales manager. But the top sales producer, what got him or her to be that top sales producer, is very, very different skill set than what's needed for that sales manager. So I'm going to leave it there. I want it to be broad enough. And then what we'll do is we'll use self-determination theory, emotional intelligence, and leader as coach as tenets to go through this. Why? Because self-determination theory is not going to change. We know that that's intrinsic motivation is important. Emotional intelligence, while it's different, has the 4 pillars, as I said: self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and relationship management. We have to be able to manage those things and regulate early. And that's that's the focus of dynamic leadership, is to move earlier upstream. And then the third one would be, what does the leader do? What does the development look like? And that's leader as coach. So I'll be bringing in some of those concepts. Why leader as coach? By the time you're a senior leader, the people who are reporting directly to you, they've been promoted. And if it's a large organization, they've been promoted twice or hired into that position. They're not going to be hired there without the skills and the capabilities. We don't need the same kind of supervisory skills, it's obvious, right, that you did early on in the management career. But as leaders, it's much more of a coaching. It's how do you guide this person and pull out the best that they have to offer? How do you get them showing up as the best version of themselves, day in and day out? And part of that requires you to hold on to that tension. And that's what this is about, holding on to that tension so that you're not losing the narrative because there's noise in the system. So that was a way of framing what March will look like, because I don't want to be organization specific or industry specific or company size specific. Although my focus, I'm thinking of companies that are less than 300 people. And the reason for that is because this is where they're going through the growing pains of adding leadership teams. Once they've gotten past that, then they can see their economies of scale improve, where their revenue per employee starts to increase. And also they already have some leadership in place. They've got the HR piece in place. They have the policies. They've got the procedures. They've got some training. But rather than just do that as a hodgepodge way, by approaching it through what I deliver in March, you'll have a plan, and then you'll be more like in your cone of focus, and there'll be some things that you just ignore. All right, that's going to be it for today. I'll chime in tomorrow. And then Wednesday, we have the Ask Me Anything starting at 7 o'clock Pacific time. So anything that comes up now or from last month or the month before, whether it's regulating so that you don't have the anxiety, or if it's regulating the people around you so they don't have the anxiety, or whether it's building an organization where you can set the climate so you don't have toxicity, but you have high performance. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.